Waterproof and breathable is a modern promise. It arrives with a small rectangular label sewn into the lining of a jacket, and it comes with a founding story about a chemist in Delaware who, one evening in October of 1969, gave a heated rod of plastic a hard yank and found that it stretched to 8 times its length instead of snapping. In the summer of 1778, two British ships under James Cook anchored off Unalaska Island in the Aleutian Chain, and the men aboard watched hunters come out to them in skin boats wearing knee-length hooded pullovers, nearly translucent, light enough to fold into a bundle the size of a loaf of bread, sewn in narrow strips from the cleaned intestines of seals and sea lions. Those garments kept the rain out. They also let the wearers sweat out, both at once. That is the entire specification of a modern rain shell, and it was being met on the beaches of the North Pacific 2 centuries before any factory anywhere could meet it. It is worth being precise about why that is strange, because for most of industrial history, the two halves of that sentence were understood to be in direct conflict. In 1823, the Scottish chemist Charles Mackintosh patented a way of dissolving rubber in coal tar naphtha and sandwiching it between two layers of cloth. The result was genuinely, reliably waterproof, which was new. It was also a bag. The rubber stiffened in cold weather and went soft and sticky in the heat. The smell was notorious, and the tailors who cut the cloth punctured it with every stitch, so the seams leaked from the day the coat was made. The seams leaked. Thomas Hancock's work on vulcanized rubber fixed some of that by the 1840s. It fixed nothing about the fundamental trade. Sailors had oilskins, cotton, or linen soaked in linseed oil, heavy and stiff. Later, there was rubberized canvas, then cloth bonded with PVC. Every one of them kept water out by sealing the wearer in, and a person working hard inside a sealed garment gets wet anyway, from the inside, which in cold weather is the version that kills you. So the problem was not merely staying dry, the problem was staying dry while sweating. Let me be careful about the claim I am making, because it would be easy to overstate. A gut parka is not a Gore-Tex jacket, and the people who made them would not have recognized the comparison. Gut is delicate. It tears where a synthetic shell would shrug. It stiffens and cracks if it dries out completely. It has to be kept supple and cared for. And a single garment could take a skilled seamstress the better part of a month. You could not buy one by the bolt. You could not mass produce it. You could not sell it to an army, and it would not survive a season of the abuse a modern shell absorbs without complaint. On durability, scale, and convenience, industrial rainwear wins, and it is not close. There is exactly one axis where the comparison holds, and it is the one the whole story turns on. Keeping outside water out while letting body moisture escape in a single garment on a working body in cold, wet conditions. On that axis, the coastal peoples of Alaska were first, and the gap is measured in centuries. The material is intestine, seal, sea lion, walrus, beluga, and in places bear. Along the coast, this garment was made by the Uningaks of the Aleutians, the Sugpiaq and Alutiiq of Kodiak and Prince William Sound, the Yupik of the Bering Sea coast and Nunivak, the Inupiat of the north, and the Siberian Yupik of St. Lawrence Island, each with their own preparation and their own stitch. Fran Reed, who spent years studying these garments in museum collections, documented how sharply the regional styles differ once you know what to look for, down to whether the strips run horizontally or in a spiral. The word most people know, kamleka, is Russian. Reed made the point that it is properly used for one particular cape form the Russians commissioned, not for the whole family of garments. And she is right, though the loose usage has stuck. The preparation is where the engineering starts. The intestine is stripped out, emptied, turned inside out and scraped, then rinsed again and again. Then it is inflated like a long balloon and dried, sometimes in the sun, sometimes deliberately outside in freezing weather. And those two routes give you different material. Winter prepared gut comes out white and opaque. Summer prepared gut stays clearer and more amber. Then the tube is split lengthwise into a flat ribbon, and the ribbons are what gets sewn edge to edge into a garment made of dozens of horizontal bands. The membrane you end up with is mostly collagen, thin enough to read light through, and it does the thing that took industrial chemistry until the second half of the 20th century to reproduce. Liquid water does not pass, water vapor does. It is also absurdly light. Some of the surviving parkas in museum collections weigh around 85 grams, which is less than a third of a good modern shell, and they fold down to nothing. And the garment was not the only use. The same membrane was cut into panels and set into the roofs and walls of sod houses as windows, letting in a soft light while keeping the weather out. It was made into bags and containers that stayed dry inside. It was stretched over frames and used to keep gear dry in a boat. This was not one clever coat. It was a whole material class, worked out in detail, with the coat as the most demanding thing you could ask of it. There is one detail most people miss, and it is the part I find most impressive: the seam. A needle makes a hole. That is what a needle is for, and every hole in a waterproof garment is a leak, which is precisely the failure that made the first Macintoshes damp inside. The solution along the Alaskan coast has several parts working together. The stitch itself does not pass all the way through the material, catching only part of the thickness, so the puncture never becomes a channel. The thread is sinew, often from porpoise or whale, and sinew swells when it gets wet, which means the thread expands inside its own needle hole and plugs it. The hole closes itself. And in many communities, a soft blade of dried beach ryegrass was rolled into the fold of the seam before stitching, so that any water that did work its way in was absorbed by the grass, which swelled in turn and shut the path behind it. Sugpiaq elder June Pardue, who learned the fold and the stitch from her mother as a small child, describes the grass in exactly those terms: a seam that seals itself tighter the wetter it gets. The shell was also only one layer of a considered outfit. Underneath went a parka of fur, or in much of the region, a parka of birdskins, sewn from the plumage of diving birds, worn feathers out in the rain and feathers in against the skin for warmth. Cook's crew recorded both ways of wearing them at Unalaska in 1778. The Yupik elder Frank Andrew, describing birdskin clothing generations later, put its virtue simply: water runs off feathers. On the head, in the Aleutians, went a bentwood hunting hat, a thin plank of wood steamed and bent into a long visor or a cone, which threw rain and glare off the face and left the eyes clear. Layered shell, insulating layer, brim. That is the same architecture your outdoor clothing uses now, arrived at from a completely different set of materials. Picture the use. Rain on gray water somewhere off Kodiak, a hunter easing a skin boat out through the swell, wearing his fur parka underneath for warmth and the gut shell over the top for weather. The hood is drawn tight around his face with a cord, and the cuffs are drawn tight at his wrists. The hem of the parka is tied down around the raised rim of the boat's cockpit, so the man and the boat become one closed surface, and the sea can slap at him all day without finding a way in. He is paddling hard. Paddling is work, and work is heat, and heat inside a sealed suit is a soaking. Not in this one. The vapor goes out through the intestine wall, while the spray runs off the outside, and he stays dry enough to keep going, which, in water that cold, is not a comfort question. Under a modern label, this would be sold as a system. It was a system. Here's where the evidence runs out. And I would rather say so than pretend. Gut rots. It is organic, thin, and it does not survive in the ground. So there is essentially no archaeological record of gut clothing the way there is for stone or bone or ivory. Museums often say these garments go back thousands of years, and that may well be true. But the claim rests on continuity, on oral history, and on the surrounding toolkit of fine bone needles and sinew thread, not on dated gut. The physical objects in collections are almost all from the late 1700s onward, which is to say, from the moment outsiders arrived with ships and started collecting. Even those are difficult to keep. Gut dries out and cracks. It reacts to handling, and conservators who have published on the treatment of early gut parkas describe a material that behaves like nothing synthetic and forgives very little. The garments sit in controlled humidity because the alternative is watching them turn brittle on the shelf. A technology that leaves almost no trace in the ground and struggles even in a museum. I have not found a single excavated garment that settles the question of age. So, the honest version is this: documented for at least 2.5 centuries, near certainly far older and unmeasurable by the methods we have. Which brings up the thing that actually puzzles me about this story. Outsiders did not fail to notice. Russian fur hunters, the Promyshelniki, were in the Aleutians from the 1740s, and their presence there was violent and coercive. The Unalaska were pressed into hunting sea otter under conditions that amounted to forced labor, and the population collapsed. Through all of that, the newcomers were entirely clear about the quality of the clothing. Russian officers commissioned gut garments for themselves in fine ceremonial versions with stand-up collars, wool tufts, and dyed esophagus worked into the seams. A Russian naval expedition under Krenitsyn and Levashov spent the winter of 1768 in the eastern Aleutians and left a detailed account of the islands and the people. Cook's ships came through 10 years later. Whalers and traders followed for the next century, and a good number of them wore this gear on the water because it was better than what they had brought with them. And none of it transferred. Not a workshop. No European workshop took the principle home and industrialized it. The gap between that beach and that Delaware laboratory stayed open for 200 years. The reason is not that anyone missed the idea. It is that the idea could not be bought. Every part of this technology is tied to a specific animal, a specific season, and a specific pair of hands. The material is a byproduct of a hunt, one animal at a time. Cleaning and drying and splitting the gut takes days of work before a single stitch. The stitch itself is a trained skill, held and taught almost entirely by women, learned young, and it does not survive being written down. The folding of the seam is the kind of knowledge that passes from hands to hands. A month of that labor produces one garment for one hunter. There is no way to scale it, no way to stockpile it, no way to put it in a catalog. European industry did not want a better raincoat so much as it wanted a raincoat you could make 10,000 of. And for that, you need a material that comes in rolls. So, the industrial world went the only direction it could go, which was to seal cloth with rubber, and then with wax, and then with plastic, and to accept the clamminess as the price. The price was paid quietly for 150 years, mostly by people working outdoors who had no way to say what the problem was, other than that they were always damp. That was simply normal. Then, October of 1969, and a frustrated man in a laboratory, Bob Gore, was trying to stretch heated rods of the polymer PTFE by a modest amount, and they kept breaking, so he yanked one hard out of irritation, and it stretched about 800% into a microporous structure, roughly 70% air. The pores were too small for a droplet of liquid water and large enough for a molecule of vapor. Waterproof and breathable. In a sheet you could laminate to fabric and produce in quantity. The rest went badly at first, which is the part that gets left out. A small Seattle outfit called Early Winters took the first commercial order in 1976 for a lightweight tent and put a jacket in the catalog the year after. Then the returns started. The membrane was contaminated by body oils, the jackets were stiff and noisy, and above all, water came in at the stitching. Bill Nicolai, who founded Early Winters, later described the jackets coming back in a flood. Gore took back millions of dollars of the first-generation fabric, reformulated the membrane, and in 1979 introduced a machine and a tape for heat bonding the seams shut. Read that sequence again, and it is the Alaskan sequence exactly in the same order. First, the membrane that passes vapor but not water, then the discovery that the membrane is not the hard part, because the needle holes are, and no garment is waterproof until the seams are solved separately. Alaskan seamstresses answered that with a stitch that never fully pierces the material, thread that swells shut, and a blade of grass in the fold. Delaware answered it with heat bonded tape. The physics underneath is not the same at all, since a collagen membrane and a stretched fluoropolymer let vapor through by different routes, and I want to be clear that this is a convergence of specification rather than of mechanism. But the shape of the problem is identical, and both traditions had to learn the second half of it the hard way. The strangest part of this story is not the technology, it is that the people who held it put it down. Not because it stopped working. Canvas arrived, then rubber, then nylon, all of them cheap, tough, and instantly available at a trading post, and all of them requiring none of the month of work. Kayak hunting declined. The sewing thinned out. Missionaries and schools cut the thread of transmission in the usual ways. By the 20th century, the sewing had stopped in most places, and in some, it stopped completely. In Prince William Sound, by the reckoning of the Sugpiaq community there, something between 100 and 150 years passed without a single gut parka being sewn. That knowledge came within one generation of ending. It did not, because a few elders still had it in their hands, and in 2022, June Pardue led a group of Alaska Native women in making a full parka from the intestines of 2 bears, cleaned, dried, split, and stitched with grass, rolled into every seam. It works. The community held a potluck when it was finished. Your rain jacket has taped seams. Look for them next time it is inside out. They are the shiny ribbons running along the inside of every stitched line, and they exist because a needle hole is a leak and always has been. Whatever the membrane is made of, the garment is only ever as waterproof as the places where 2 pieces meet, and that has been the real problem the whole time, on both sides of 2 centuries and an ocean. Which leaves the question I cannot answer, and neither so far can anyone else. Those hunters were wearing a fully solved version of this garment when Cook's ships turned up. So solved that the refinements are decorative rather than structural, and a technology that mature does not appear in a generation. How long had it already been working before anyone wrote a word of it down? The material that would tell us has rotted away, everywhere, every time.